Welcome back for part 4 of the chapter 54 lecture. We left off talking about secondary succession, and I mentioned that human disturbance typically is going to cause secondary succession, but it could be a natural disturbance. Something like a forest fire sparked by lightning is going to follow secondary succession patterns. But humans have a huge impact when we cut down a forest to grow agriculture, or even if we harvest an agricultural field, we're going to see secondary succession happen, and we're going to see the same pattern that we described in primary succession lead that barren landscape to a thriving ecosystem. That's true in both terrestrial and marine settings. So when we see something like bottom trawling, we've got this healthy ecosystem up here. It's been pretty demoralized down here. So that, over the course of a couple of thousand years may return to something sort of similar to this. It's not going to be the same, but it's going to return, be restored to some sort of a reef setting. Hopefully that makes sense. I apologize. I got cut into 3 different videos. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to come see me and talk to me about it. The last, or the next section, I should say, is going to talk about these biogeographical factors that are going to affect community diversity. So we're trying to bring things from the last chapter and connect them to the community rather than just the population itself. So in terms of species richness, the different number of species that we see, we're going to see a lot more richness in the tropics and a lot less richness in the poles because you need to be more adapted. It takes a really special kind of organism to live near the poles, so there aren't going to be a lot of various life forms that can fill those niches. And I sort of hit on climate and evolutionary history together there. Like it says here, there's been more time for speciation to occur. That's something that I left out in the last slide. Those ecosystems haven't been under ice. They haven't been covered, so they've had a lot of time to diversify. We can go pretty quickly through this slide. Basically, what we're looking at is evapotranspiration, which is the amount of water that's leaving the ecosystem and going into the environment. That's going to lead to more rainfall. That's going to basically what we're measuring is water loss, but if there's more water loss, there's going to be more water fall because it's going to be in the air. We need to think about things like the rain shadow that we saw with mountains. We need to think about wind patterns and think about why areas near rainforests might receive a lot of water or not, depending on where they are with the global wind patterns. We see that connects with species richness. When evapotranspiration are higher, we're going to see a lot of species richness because there's the potential for a lot of warmth and rainfall, so there's a lot of potential for plant growth. Areas where we don't see a lot of evapotranspiration or we're upwind of a lot of evapotranspiration, there's not going to be a lot of available water, so the number of plants that can live in those areas is significantly smaller. Think about cacti and succulents and things like that in the desert versus the number of trees we see here in the deciduous forest in our ecosystem. There's also another factor that affects some species more than others, and that's basically population density. You can see that you can mathematically calculate that. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because that's not a calculation that they expect us to do on the AP exam, but when you go to college someday, this is something that you'll definitely need to calculate, and you can see there's an algebraic calculation, so it's not a huge deal. Some species can be far more dense than others. Some organisms are territorial and they're a top predator, so they need a lot of space, or they're a tree that drops poisonous needles that choke out everything around them, like we see with some spruces. One of the last big ideas is this island equilibrium model, and that's basically that richness on islands is going to be a balance between who's moving in and who's dying off. It's an island, so there's less immigration and immigration than there would be in a mainland population. So essentially, on an island, who's coming in, what new genes are being introduced to the gene pool, and which genes are being lost. That's going to affect the species diversity. Remember, species diversity is just the differences amongst organisms of the same species. So that probably is a pretty logical thing. If you've got a small gene pool, you're all going to be really similar. If you start adding a bunch of new organisms, a bunch of new genes, then the species is going to become a lot more diverse. The community is going to be more diverse as well, because niches are going to be filled because, again, you have diversity. Smaller islands do tend to have lower immigration rates, so more things go extinct because there are fewer resources to compete over, and there are, again, fewer niches. So there are fewer places for weirdos to fit in and find their spot where they're fit. This is something that came up on the AP exam maybe 2 years ago, maybe 3 years ago. And it's the fact that islands that are really close to the mainland are going to have really high immigration rates because, like, imagine you're a bird. If you are flying to an island that's near the coast, that's easier than flying to an island that's really far away. So you're going to have a lot more immigration and emigration on large islands close to the mainland. And that equilibrium point at which the gene pool is more or less stable is this theoretical island equilibrium model. If you're a senior and you've had econ, this looks a lot like a supply and demand curve, and that's on purpose. The equilibrium number is that sweet spot between immigration and extinction. What's coming in, what's going out. This is our gene pool in theory. Of course, pathogens can mess with a community. Remember, a community is just a sum of the populations. So some pathogens, viruses, prions, microorganisms, things that are like parasitic organisms can be passed from one population to another. So it's going to affect the whole community. It's not just going to affect one population, especially if that pathogen gets taken to a new ecosystem. Lots of new hosts to expose and take down and all those kinds of great things. Excuse me. There's an example that your book talks through that's white band disease that is really dangerous and devastating. If a coral reef is exposed to it, it's going to wipe out the whole ecosystem. And then the oak sudden death syndrome, or sudden oak death syndrome, same kind of thing. It's a disease that can really wipe out a bunch of different species. So again, it affects the whole community, not just one population. Swine flu is an example of this in humans that moved from one species to another. The bird flu was really similar because it went from birds to pigs to humans, and again affected all three members of that community. Kind of some vocab. A vector is something that carries a disease to us. So something like mosquitoes carrying all the mosquito-borne illnesses, West Nile and all that kind of stuff. The mosquito is called a vector. And then those pathogens are called zoonotic because, zoo always means animal. And so they're coming from animals and going to humans. Talk through most of those. So here's kind of the summary of the slide from maybe 2 chapters ago. This kind of expands it. We talked a lot about these mutualistic relationships, symbiotic relationships down here. We've talked quite a bit about predator-prey, definitely parasitism, herbivory we haven't talked a lot about, but I think that probably makes sense. And in competition, we covered in our Oh Deer lab. I think we're probably in pretty good shape there. So that's the end of chapter 54.